Welcome to the training for the First Approach Skills Training Early Childhood Manual. My name is Cindy Ola Trevino. I'm a psychologist with Seattle Children's Hospital, and I'm also an assistant professor with the University of Washington, and I'm with the Partnership Access Line. And today I'm just going to provide you with a training overview to the FAST manual, and we're going to start off by talking a little bit about the background and the research on early childhood development. We're also going to talk about how to identify families for the FAST-E manual. And then we're going to talk about how to engage families if you've identified a family, for example, who you think is going to benefit from FAST-E, how do you engage them to participate in this work with you? And then we're also going to talk about the FAST-E manual. So I'll provide an overview of the different handouts and how you can use them and how to talk about them with families. And then we're going to talk about just questions and what to expect for the live training. So early childhood, as you may already know, is just filled with so much joy, excitement. These little ones have so many new experiences that they're having and so many things that they're seeing for the first time. And it can be really exciting to kind of see the smile on their faces when they are learning something new or how interested they are in the things around them. And at the same time, during this age range, so this early childhood age range that we're referring to is between the ages of 1 and about 4 years old. There's a lot of brain development that's happening at this age. So there's a lot of, they're learning a lot of language, communication skills, their motor skills are coming on. So if you think about a 1-year-old versus a 3 or 4-year-old, for example, their abilities to kind of run, jump, climb has exponentially grown. The other thing that we notice from these little ones is that emotionally, they're also developing, at a rapid pace. They are experiencing emotions for the first time. So they're, most of the time they can be happy, joyful, and excited about certain things. But at other times, they might get scared. They might be experiencing disappointment, frustration, and anger. And because there's so much rapid development that's happening, really, we can see a lot of things kind of present themselves like tantrums and meltdowns, right? Because they're at a point where their skills are developing rapidly. They want to be independent and do things on their own, but yet they're still really young, right? Really young and still need a parent and caregiver to do the things that maybe they feel capable of doing. So this can often result in a lot of meltdowns, tantrums, and challenges. So overall, parenting at this age can be both joyous and exciting, fulfilling, rewarding, and overwhelming at the same time because there's all these things kind of happening. I think it's helpful to kind of take a little bit of a dive into the brain science literature here, because one of the things that we know about brain development is that about 1/4 of the child's brain develops in just the first year of life. At about 2 or 3 years of age, for example, about 80% of the child's brain develops. And then by age 5, 90% of the child's brain has developed. And what we mean by that is that all the neural connections that are needed to understand language, communication, all those kinds of things are forming. And you can see in this image here that you see kind of a newborn's brain and the neural connections that they have. And you can see by 1 month, there's they're almost, there's a few more. By 9 months, a lot more. And then at 2 years, you can see that almost all the neural connections are there, and it looks fairly similar to an adult brain, right? So because the brain is developing so rapidly and so quickly, it's such an opportune time to intervene early, right? Many of you have probably heard about the importance of early intervention. And providing supports early for kids at this age. And the reason for that is because the brain is developing so rapidly that if we notice any delays, any challenges, if we can provide intervention at this age, we can see really some greater growth and development from providing these early intervention supports. The other thing about the brain is that even though the neural connections are forming in these early years, there are other parts of the brain that are continuing to develop over, you know, a child's lifetime, really. And that the part of the brain that really is the last to develop, as you've all probably are well aware of, is what's called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So this is the part of the brain that controls our executive functioning skills. So this is things like planning, organizing, inhibiting your behavior, your impulses, emotional regulation. So it's a part of the brain that's very, very can be very, very helpful for us in school and even in adulthood, right? So in the 5-year-old brain, that part of the brain is not very mature or developed. So if you can see from this graph here, the red and the orange and the yellow means that the parts of the brain are less fully mature, whereas the blue and purple indicates that a brain is more fully matured in that area. So you can see from 5-year-old brain to even the preteen brain, it's not quite there yet, right? It doesn't develop more fully until about 20 years old or so. And so for these many reasons that we just talked about, right, that the brain is developing so rapidly, that parts of the brains that might help us with emotional regulation, inhibition, because all of those things are happening at around the same time, right? We're growing and developing, but yet we don't have the breaks that we need to help us kind of regulate well in certain instances. It really can create a lot of chaos, right? So it's no wonder that little ones have so many meltdowns and tantrums, and transitions can be hard, and new experiences are challenging. And I think that in itself, if we think about the little ones, right, and the parents that they come with, parenting at this age can be really challenging. So I just want to take a moment to talk about parenting in the early years, because a lot of the work in early childhood, as much as I went into this field feeling like, oh, I love the little ones, I could spend all day with them. A lot of my work ends up being spent with the parents and the caregivers, right? So young children do not exist in a vacuum. They often come with other adults who are taking care of them. And so a lot of our work in the fasting manual is really directed toward having tools and strategies that you can then share back with the caregivers that are caring for these toddlers, these preschoolers. And as I mentioned, this time frame in early childhood can be really overwhelming, and so hence parents can be overwhelmed. And so identifying these strategies that will equip them to both build a positive parent-child relationship and to help them deal with some of the most common challenges in early childhood, which could be things like, meltdowns, tantrums, behavioral issues. It could be things like emotional dysregulation. It could be things like learning to separate, toileting, sleep. So all these things, if we can equip parents to be able to handle these things early on, we could see really some positive effects, meaning that if we intervene early, we can put kids back on, a path to success later on. So I wanted to take a moment to briefly talk about early childhood mental health, because this is a whole area of experts. There's folks out there that really focus on this age range, right? 0 to 5, 0 to 3, and focusing on early childhood mental health during this age range. So I wanted to take a moment to share with you the definition that's provided by 0 to 3. 0 to 3 is a organization that hosts a conference. I think it's every other year, where they focus specifically on infant and early childhood mental health. And I like their definition because it's all encompassing to the things that we think are important during this age range, and the things that are helpful to consider when trying to promote kind of a positive social emotional well-being and development in this age range. So they define early childhood mental health as the developing capacity of the child to form close and secure adult and peer relationships, where they can experience, manage, and express a full range of emotions and explore the environment and learn all in the context of family, community, and culture. I like this definition because it involves a couple of different components, right? So the first and most important one during this age range is that young children have a close and secure relationship with their caregiver. So that's a big part of the child's kind of responsibility during this age range. And so portions of the FAST-D manual are going to comprise of techniques and tools that from the literature we've learned that are really important in kind of building that close and secure relationship and attachment with their toddler and their preschooler. And then the second part in this definition is really helping children experience the full range of emotions. And so really thinking about how do we promote emotional regulation? How do we promote positive expression of emotions and coping? And so a portion of the manual is focused specifically on that, right? How do we help kiddos express their emotions, but also learn to set limits around specific behaviors that are okay and not okay, and how to do that in a way that can continue to where parents can continue to kind of maintain, again, that close and secure attachment with their child. And then the third one is really helping children explore their environment in the context of family, community, and culture. So with the FAST-D manual, we know that a lot of times these little toddlers and preschoolers, of course, might also have a preschool setting or another setting where there's another caregiver involved, for example. So there are tools in the manual where we are wanting to focus more on how to communicate with teachers that might be involved in the child's life. So I wanted to share a list of some of the most common challenges that we see in early childhood. And I just want to add the caveat that diagnosis or providing a diagnosis in this early childhood age range is not really as important, and oftentimes it's really challenging, right? Like there might not be a specific diagnosis that encapsulates the challenges that the toddler or preschool might be having. And at this age, really what we're more concerned about is just treating the symptoms. And on the next slide, I'll show you a little bit about what are some of the most common challenges and disorders that tend to happen at this age range, but is not necessarily the case, right? So some of the most common challenges that we see are related to behavior. So where toddlers and preschoolers are having tantrums, meltdowns, they might be having a hard time sharing. We often tend to see a lot of concerns around anxiety as well. I would say those are probably the top two concerns here. A lot of our preschoolers and toddlers, for example, are experiencing new situations for the first time, right? So they might be going to preschool for the first time. It's their first trip to the grocery store. It's their first time kind of getting on an airplane, right? So there's a lot of firsts during this time. And so there's likely to be a lot of anxiety or uncertainty about that. And I think a common one that often comes up in early childhood is also around separation. So if the toddler or preschooler is going to daycare or preschool for the first time, they might be having some anxiety around that, right? Where's mom going to be? How am I going to be there? Are you going to come back for me? So all those kinds of things might come up. And then also at this age range, there's a lot of sleep, feeding, and toileting concerns. And then depending on the child's development and how they've been developing, in their first couple months, in their first few years of life, if there are concerns around development, this is usually the time when we want to be, again, paying careful attention to that and referring as needed. So these I would say are the most common concerns that come up. So this is a table from the CDC that just breaks down the frequency of depression, anxiety, and behavior disorders by age. And you can see that the graph here outlines the age 3 to 5. The early childhood age range, as we're defining it for the FAST-D manual, it's between 1 and 4 years of age. So here we're not getting to see that early toddlerhood years necessarily, but here what we are seeing is kind of more of that preschool age range. And overall, we do see some rates of depression, anxiety, and behavior disorders. And like I mentioned, we're not so much necessarily worried about a diagnosis at this age, so much as the symptoms. And here, based on the graph, we can see that behavior disorders are the most common, followed by anxiety. Our goal with FAST-D is that we can give clinicians and providers tools that they can use to really, hopefully, right, change the trajectory of these symptoms, whether it's anxiety or behavioral problems, so that they are less likely or they may present with these symptoms less as they get older. So really taking on an early intervention kind of prevention lens. So our FAST-D manual is really based on a variety of different evidence-based programs that are out there for this age range. And so what I thought I would do is just kind of break these up a little bit so you can see evidence-based programs for each of the different symptoms or disorders that you might encounter. So for behavior problems, there are two really excellent evidence-based programs for addressing the early childhood behavior problems. That includes the parent-child interaction therapy, so that's PCIT. There's also the Incredible Years, and there's two versions of that program for the toddlerhood years and then also for the preschool age range. For anxiety, we see that there are two programs as well. There's PCIT, so parent-child interaction therapy, but an adaptation of that program is called CALM, that's specifically for anxiety. And then there's also a group-based program called Cool Little Kids for anxiety, and I believe they also have a online program that parents can do kind of on their own, self-guided, to address early childhood anxiety. And then for kids who've experienced trauma or significant stressors in their life, there are two programs here that focus on that. So there's a trauma-informed PCIT program, and then there's also a program called Attachment Vitamins that is directed toward parents and caregivers and their little ones who've experienced either a significant kind of separation or trauma. And then we also have programs that focus on promoting early relational health. So what we mean by early relational health is essentially this, it's the relationship between the parent and the child and how well the child is kind of functioning in that parent-child relationship, right? Is it secure? Is it nurturing? Is the parent responsive? So all those things we know from research can be really protective for the developing brain. And so these two programs listed here are some of the programs that are out there that focus more specifically on this area. So first is Filming Interactions to Nurture Development, and then the other program is Promoting First Relationships. So I think there are a few others, of course, but these are just a few to kind of highlight. So FAST-E incorporates a focus on promotion. So we want to promote positive social emotional well-being for the child. We also want to take kind of a prevention stance and also provide treatment at the same time. So we want to provide these three things to parents and young children to really help support them in promoting the social emotional development of their toddlers and preschoolers. And then also to prevent and treat mental health issues as early as possible. So next, I'm going to share a little bit about the screening and type measures that you can use for FAST-D. But first, who is FAST-E for? So as I mentioned, we're really thinking of FAST-D as meant for parents or other caregivers of children ages 1 to 4. These are some of, I think, the top problems that you might encounter for parents that might be getting referred to you for FAST-D. So that might be tantrums or meltdowns that the child is having, if they're having a hard time kind of regulating their emotions, or the parent is having a hard time kind of helping them regulate. Because I think at this age, there could be a combination of that, right? Children still need a little bit of help regulating their emotions, but we also want them to start building their independence around that. If there's sleep problems, if there's kind of some feeding issues, if there's some anxiety related to separating, or the parent, or the provider that the parent and child are working with, that they're having a difficult time kind of connecting with the child or following the child's cues, then I think FAST-D can be really helpful for these group of kids. And in general, as I go through the manual, you'll see that there's a lot of content in here that I think could really be beneficial for any parent who is really just interested in kind of strengthening their parenting skills, or really interested in kind of incorporating some tools to help, again, bolster their child's emotional development. So really, I think anyone can benefit from these programs, but in general, here are the things that I would say might be the most common things to come up, and parents and kiddos that can definitely benefit from FAST-D. So as far as screening for FAST-D, there's a couple of tools that are available for free that you are welcome to use as part of either to screen families who might benefit for FAST-D, or to also use it kind of as a progress monitoring tool. So the first is the preschool feelings checklist. So this one specifically screens for a lot of different anxiety or mood kind of related symptoms in young kids, and it's the age range for this tool is 36 months to 6 years. There's also the preschool pediatric symptom checklist. So this one I think is similar to just the pediatric symptom checklist that a lot of pediatricians, primary care clinics use, but this is kind of a preschool adapted version of it. And this one is intended for kids 18 months to 5 years of age, 5 years and 5 months. And then there's also the baby pediatric symptom checklist. So this one is anywhere from 1 month to 17 months of age. All of these tools are available for free online. And then, as I mentioned, to kind of just reiterate that in this age range, we're really not necessarily worried about diagnosing, but more so kind of identifying symptoms and treating the symptoms. I think if there was a diagnosis for this young age range, it's usually ends up being kind of a very unspecified, non-specific diagnosis, because a lot of times the symptoms that we're seeing haven't, fully developed, fully manifested into a specific diagnosis necessarily. So it could be something like disruptive behavior disorder, right? Like a very unspecified diagnosis, or unspecified anxiety disorder. Okay, so possible rule outs for FAST-D, we've listed a couple here. So one of them, I think trauma would be one. Usually these group of parents and caregivers and, toddlers or preschoolers that they might have who've experienced, significant trauma might need more intensive programs. So I mentioned quite a few on the other couple slides there. That could be PCIT, for example, or attachment vitamins or something like that for the family. Again, that's not to say that the things in our handouts will not be helpful, but I think for these families, usually there's other tools and strategies that might be helpful to kind of just hone in on other challenges that they might be experiencing that's related to the trauma. The other is autism spectrum disorder. And then also if there's any child abuse or CPS case, for example, open, on the child or family unit, then maybe a higher level of service might be needed at that point. Okay, so this is an example of the preschool feelings checklist. So you can see some of the different items here. The first one is my child is almost always interested in playing with other kids, frequently appears sad or says they feel sad, has a lot of trouble following simple directions or rules. So you can kind of go through these items, and it's just a yes or no response to these questions. And then you would just kind of tally up the yes versus no responses. Here you can see an example of the preschool pediatric symptom checklist. So asking about whether or not the child seems nervous or afraid, seems sad or unhappy, getting upset if things aren't done a certain way, having a hard time with change. So you can kind of see the different questions here that they're trying to target both like anxiety, related concerns, attention issues, some behavioral issues, aggression, those kinds of things. And then you can see that the response items here are 0, 1, 2, so not at all, somewhat, very much. Okay, so a lot of times I think it's helpful to know, that when you have a preschooler or a parent who is referred to you, and if you've identified them as potentially benefiting from FAST-E, sometimes some of the tools and strategies we encourage the parents to use might not result in significant improvements at times. And so when that is the case, or even beforehand, it's often helpful to figure out what might be going on for the family. I often think about this as kind of like really trying to understand the family system and context, because I think that can really be informative as to what the family needs or what's going on for the family. So oftentimes, as you've probably seen this image before, we might be seeing kind of the peak of the iceberg that's presenting itself as, the child behavior problems, or the child's anxiety for separating, or something like that, or even just, the parent's stress level, or the parent having a hard time managing the child's behavior, right? So we might be seeing the peak of the problem, but oftentimes there could be other things underlying that. So I've just listed a few here that might be that are possibilities. So like environmental stress, trauma, speech concerns, neurodevelopmental disorders, sleep disorders, toileting issues, genetic disorders, parent mental health. So all these different things, again, could be things that are impacting the symptoms or behaviors that we're trying to target. And so I think it's helpful to understand them, and then also know that we might not always be able to treat them all, right? So thinking about triaging, right? What else might this family need? What other supports might they need that we might be able to get them connected with, to again help address that concern. Because if it's something else that's going on, it might be that the family needs some additional supports. Okay, so we're going to talk now about just how to engage families in FAST-E. And I'm just going to share with you a little bit about how I talk with families, especially when I'm working with a parent who has a young child. Usually this is their first time interacting with the mental health system, right? With somebody who's providing mental health services. And I feel like oftentimes that can be a scary place for a parent to come, right? To think that their young child might have a mental health issue, or might have a mental health problem, or, something of that nature. And so it can be really challenging and kind of scary for parents. And so I think as a provider, as a clinician, it's really, really important to approach parents, in a really kind, really kind of empathetic way, to make them feel, again, that this is the right place and there's nothing wrong with their child or their parenting. It's just that we know these early childhood years can be really challenging, right? So that's essentially part of my pitch when I work with parents in this age range. And I think it's often really important to just share with parents, parenting during the early years, right? When their child is a toddler, preschooler, can be challenging and really overwhelming at times, because their child is just learning and growing so much during this age range, that sometimes that their emotional capabilities aren't quite caught up to where their brain or their skills are developing, right? And so it can be really helpful to provide some additional support for parents. And really FAST-D is focused on enhancing parents' skills so that they can be the best parents that they can for their growing child, right? And they're already probably really great parents, and sometimes toddlers are just challenging, and we got to try a few different things to see what works, to see how they might respond better, right? Or how we can get them to follow through with a choice or an expectation that the parent has set. And so that's, I think, one of the things that I kind of talk with parents about, and really kind of framing it in a way of saying, we just want to help things go better for your toddler and for yourself. And we think these things can help because they're based in, research and science. And so it can be helpful for both the parent and the child. So now we're going to get a chance to talk through the FAST-E manual. So I'm going to go ahead and share that with you here. So this is an outline of the FAST-E manual. So you can see that we have a set of core skills that we think any parent, again, would benefit from these skills. So it's broken down into different checkpoints. We go anywhere from thinking through how to boost their child's development, to communication, to enhancing that parent-child relationship, and supporting their child's emotional development. And of course, there are tantrums and meltdowns that happen during this age range. So we focus on how to boost the child's independence and how to boost their ability to follow directions. So we talk more, I'll show you more in detail the different handouts. And then because there are a lot of other challenges that happen during this age range that maybe are not captured by these things, we have a few other what we call bonus checkpoints. So the first here is that, if the parent has concerns about their child's development or maybe potentially having developmental delays, there's a handout for that. We also have a handout for how to work with the child's teacher, if they're currently enrolled in a preschool or attending an early childhood center. We also have a handout on sleep, on anxiety, specifically anxiety around separating from the parent or caregiver, and then also some handouts around meal times and picky eaters, and then how to support the child's toilet training if that is a question that comes up for you. So now I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the FAST-E manual. So this is the cover of the FAST-E manual. Here you can see that we have just what we call the roadmap to the FAST-E checkpoints. So we wanted the manual to have a layout to just indicate that parenting is a journey, right? There's no necessarily a straight line for, here's how you get through these challenging moments. It's going to be a windy road at times, right? Things will get better. We might see a little bit of a deviation or a detour, but we can kind of get back on track. So we have the checkpoints here listed from 1 through 6 that I think are checkpoints that we think most parents with young kids can benefit from. And then we have a few bonus checkpoints. So here are the bonus checkpoints that a family can choose from. Then we have just an orientation page that outlines, how FAST-E was developed, who it's designed for, and then what FAST-E does not cover. So it does not cover early childhood trauma. We don't touch on developmental concerns that might be related to autism spectrum disorder. And then we don't touch necessarily on like co-parenting relationship problems or childhood anxiety. For childhood trauma, for example, I think clinicians and providers can reference the FAST-E manual for some guidance. And then for childhood anxiety, of course, clinicians and providers can also reference the FAST-A manual. If you also feel like there are some behavioral challenges, right, like non-compliance, oppositional challenges that maybe feel like there could be other techniques that you can draw from that are also part of the FAST-B manual, then I think you can go ahead and do that. Because FAST-B is designed for, 4 to slight older kiddos. And so you can always supplement with some of the other manuals as well. Here we have just some suggestions for how to use FAST-E. Again, we mentioned that you can really start with any of the checkpoints. The ones that are kind of outlined from 1 through 6 or so, those are kind of the core that we think, all parents can really find helpful. And then the bonus checkpoints, of course, you can use ad hoc, so as needed. Here we list the different rating skills that you can use to track progress or to identify families. And we have a note for parents here that, if they are concerned about their child's development, if their child has unusual sleep or breathing issues, or, their feeding is really impacting their weight and their growth, then of course, these are conversations to have with their child's doctor. So this is really the first checkpoint where we are, the title of the handout is Boosting Your Child's Development. And here what we want parents to kind of take away is that, a child's brain is really developing and they're really like sponges. So they are constantly taking in information from around the world. They're trying to make sense of it. And really we want this workbook to be a place where we can help them kind of learn, connect, and thrive with their child. And then it's a moment to have parents kind of reflect on what their child is doing, what they feel like are some areas where their child is still developing skills, and maybe we'd want them to work on those skills with the FAST-E content. So here, for example, we have some example child skills, so like sharing, walking with balance, sleeping in their own bed, sharing toys. So here, the parent can list the skills that their child already has, and maybe these are things that the parent thinks their child does very well. And then here on the other side, we want the parent to write down skills that they feel like their child is still developing in. What are some things that they're maybe not so good at, that we have trouble with, that we really want them to kind of grow and develop in? And this is, I think, as a provider clinician, it'd be really helpful to know, because then we're kind of taking in this information as we're moving through the FAST-E manual. Because, as I mentioned earlier, the young children do not exist in a vacuum, right? They come with parents, caregivers, and so oftentimes there's a lot that parents and caregivers bring into that parent-child relationship. And so we also want parents and caregivers to reflect on what they bring to their parenting, and really outlining, what are some things that they feel like they do really well, right? What are the things that they really enjoy about their parenting? What skills do they feel like they already have? And kind of reflecting and thinking about those and listing them here. And then on the other side, we want them to reflect on what are some of the parenting skills that you feel like are maybe your weakness. What are some skills that you're hoping to learn more about or develop or change? What would you like to change about your parenting? And so this is where we'd want them to kind of write some of those things down. That's helpful, again, information as a provider, as a clinician, because as we're working through the FAST-E manual, if I've heard the parent kind of say, I really would like to learn, how to be more patient, or how to, what to do when my child has a meltdown in the middle of a grocery store, right? Like, how do I handle that kind of situation? Then, of course, the modules or the checkpoints in the FAST-E manual are going to be helpful in guiding you or guiding the parent along the way. So here on this page, again, is where we have the list of the different core skills in the FAST-E manual, and then the bonus skills. So here the parent can choose, well, I would really like to focus on my self-care. I want to learn how to help my child with tantrums. And then if there's a few other bonus skills that they would like to learn or draw from, then they can check mark those, and then that will guide kind of the different checkpoints that you draw from. Part of this first checkpoint is also talking with parents about self-care, which is key. Oftentimes parents are at the center of their child's world, and they tune into their mood, their energy, their feelings. And I think especially if for parents of young kids, they have to give so much all the time that it's really hard to either take time for themselves, or they feel guilty about it, or it's just hard to do that with a toddler or preschooler. And so it's important to talk with parents about parents and the caregivers surrounding the toddler, that it's important to take time for regular self-care activities. And it doesn't have to be very long, right? It could be 5 minutes where they find moments to kind of calm themselves, moments to do things that they enjoy. And we try to list activities here that are going to tap into their 5 senses, because we know that those are kind of some key skills that might help somebody kind of regulate, return back to the present moment without worrying about the what ifs or the future, or, all those things kind of get us out of that headspace into the now. So we, of course, list some example activities, and then we encourage the parent with this handout to write down what it is those activities are for them, where they could do, 5 minutes during their day to engage in them. And then identifying, when would be a time in your day when you can do this. And trying to be, again, realistic with the parent. And I just love this message up here, right? That we cannot pour from an empty cup. So we want to take care of ourselves. Okay, so then the next checkpoint is titled Boosting Your Child's Communication, and it's an introduction to serve and return. So serve and return is a very kind of well-known and powerful concept that's out there now, that's informed by kind of brain science and the early childhood literature. And serve and return is this idea that that learning happens when the parent and child kind of interact. So when the parent pays attention to the child's cues, and then the parent then responds to the child's cues in a positive, engaging, and nurturing way. And that interaction that the parent has is what helps build strong connections in their developing brain. So we actually encourage all parents of really young kids to participate in this game of serve and return, right? Where their child might serve, meaning that they might look at something, say something, or do something, and the parent needs to interpret that as a serve, right? Your child is communicating something, and then we return that serve by responding to that cue. So we could either name what it is they're looking at, what they're saying, or what they're doing, or we may copy what they're doing or looking at. And then we could also just provide support or just encouragement, right? If they happen to say something, we can just repeat what they said, for example. And then we encourage parents to know that, we only return behaviors that are neutral, calm, or positive. So we're not necessarily returning serves that are kind of aggressive or destructive, that we can practice other kind of tools for those moments. But in general, when their child is having these serves, we want to be able to return the serve by doing those things that I mentioned. So whether that's copying the sounds, words, expressions, or actions, or providing support to the child or encouraging them. And here's this picture kind of just outlines that, right? So the girl is like looking at the parent is looking back at them. The little girl has a facial expression, and you can see that kind of mom is trying to either match that or imitate that expression. So the cues of serve and return can be really subtle, but they can be really just so critical and important for this specific age range. And then from the research, we know that when parents engage in serve and return, it can really help them learn to communicate, help with building their language, their help kind of build their attention and focus. This serve and return interaction as well mimics how to do turn taking and verbal interaction. So children really learn a lot from just these simple yet important connections. The other thing is that serve and return is essentially the foundation to building a positive relationship with their child, which is really key for when we're trying to set limits and address challenging behavior. So when parents can first pay attention to their child's cues, right, their child serves, and when they're having those positive serves or cues, and we respond to them, we're kind of building, again, not only those neural connections, but we're also building that relationship. And then when we need to set limits, we can do so in a more effective way because we've essentially been paying attention to the child's serves and returns throughout. So when talking with a family about serve and return, one of the things that that can be helpful for parents is to kind of just track how it went, right? So what did they notice? How did they copy their child? What did they do after their child, served, right? If they responded or returned the serve by copying what their child did. So then we want the parent to know, or pay attention to what happened next, right? The idea is that these serve and return interactions will continue to go back and forth. And then we also want to know or want the parent to reflect on how they felt during that interaction and kind of putting themselves in their child's shoes about how they may have felt and what they maybe learned from their child during that interaction. Checkpoint 3 is focused mostly on boosting boosting the parent-child relationship through special time. So this checkpoint is pretty similar to probably content you've seen in the FAST-B manual. So we want to encourage, even at this age, right, to have parents engage in play activities with their child to build, again, that positive relationship. Because play at this age, oftentimes what I tell parents is that their toddler or their preschool spends a lot of time playing, and that's how they're learning about the world around them. That's how they're learning social skills. That's when they learn a lot of fine motor skills. They're also learning language and communication through play. So they just learn so much that if we want to, bolster their learning, but then also strengthen our relationship with our child, even more so than it already is, the best thing we can do is engage with them through play. And we can teach them a lot about emotions, right, and positive behavior through play. So we encourage parents to kind of participate in this time for, 10 to 15 minutes per day with their child, one-on-one if possible. At this age, we do want parents to kind of provide choices for activities that they can engage in, and reminding the parent that, we don't want to pick anything that has rules or that kind of thing. No screens, of course. And then really it's the parents, we want the parent to follow the child's lead. During special playtime, I think is a great time to practice using serve and return. So we want parents to actually notice what their child is looking at, doing, or saying, and then be able to respond. And then we encourage parents to be something like, a sports commentator. So identifying the good behavior, commenting on it out loud, and then you can, the parent can be imitating what their child is doing. So this is just an example, again, of things that the parent might say. So you're putting the blue Legos on the green base. You're building it higher. So again, being descriptive. Here we have special time do's and don'ts, which are pretty similar to the FAST-B handout here. As for the do's, we encourage the parent to set a timer, provide choices for activities, and really letting the child choose and lead the activity. And again, the parent's role is to kind of be a sports commentator. And then following along with the child if if they make changes in an activity, so if they go from one thing to another, kind of following their lead, and a few others listed here. And then the don'ts are, avoiding questions, avoiding giving too many instructions or suggestions. And this playtime is really not a time to, teach the child to do anything properly or bring up past or future, all those kinds of things. Really, it should be a time of positive connection, learning, and kind of that relationship enhancement. So here are just some suggested activities. And again, the parent can also come up or suggest other ones that they feel like their child really enjoys. So this handout here just outlines all the what ifs, so possible questions that you might have from a parent or caregiver around the playtime. So my child can decide on an activity or chooses one that's too messy. So there's like some tips here that you might address with the parent for that question. Other questions here are, my child is making a mess or trying to annoy me. My child gets angry when it's time to end. My child already spends so much time with me, so how is this different? That's a very popular one. Or I just don't have the time for this, right? So just some common questions that we hear from parents, and then here are some bullet points that might help you address those questions with the parent. And then there is a special playtime tracking sheet for the parents, so where they can list the activity and then how they returned their child's serve. So how did the child serve? What did they do? And then what did the parent do after that? So what did they comment on? How did it feel? And any problems or concerns that came up. So the idea is that serve and return kind of sets the parent up well to then do special playtime, right? So serve and return is something that the parent can do anytime during the day, and we would hope that that's happening, right? That the parent is paying attention to the child's cues, either labeling, naming, copying the child, or if they notice that the child's cue is like going and picking up a book, right? So a cue could be anything, as I mentioned, saying or doing something, or a change in their facial expression. And then if a parent responds to the cue by helping the child with a book or something like that, or naming the book that the child is picking up, right? So the serve and return interaction is something that can happen at any time and can be especially helpful when the parent is diving into doing special playtime. Okay, so the next checkpoint 4 is on boosting the child's emotional development. So here what we're focused on is on modeling emotional vocabulary to help the child learn to share about their feelings. And we want to focus on essentially helping children kind of cope with all the various different emotions that they might be having, because as we know, young children may not always be able to tell us in words what they want. They often cry, shout, cling, or throw things. And then a big part of their early development is learning kind of to notice and regulate their emotions and behaviors. And caregivers and parents can help do this by doing a couple of things. One is teaching them about emotions, helping them soothe when they're having an emotion, and then also modeling coping skills. Apologies there. Modeling good coping skills. So this handout here just outlines kind of the first step really in teaching about emotions, is really helping them recognize and understand emotions. So we got to think about all the emotion words that we know, because all the ones that we know are the ones that our children are likely to learn, right? So thinking about the words that we can use to describe the feelings. So happy, feeling proud, feeling calm. What are other words that the parent can come up with there? Feeling embarrassed, disappointed, or sad, or frustrated, angry, and hurt, right? So there are a lot of other emotion words underneath that we might encourage the parent or caregiver to come up with. So the first tool in really helping the child regulate their emotions is that the parent or caregiver has to model labeling their own emotions first, right? Because parents are their children's first teachers, right? So they look to us, right? Oftentimes they imitate us. What we do, they do. And so if we can model labeling our emotions in a simple way using simple words, right, that they can understand, then that's a really good first step that we can start to do pretty early on. So an example might be, I'm feeling angry because the dog chewed up my shoes, right? And so then we have a space for the parent to kind of share an example. Then we also want the parent to then start to label the child's emotions or feelings. Oftentimes, it'll take a while for kids to start to do this, but as a parent, part of what we can do, or as a caregiver, part of what we can do is start to label the child's emotions. We might not always know what emotion is underlying the behavior, but we can take a guess at how they might be feeling. Oftentimes when parents do this, it can really help children feel like really a sense of relief, like, wow, my big emotions are understood, right? My parent gets me. They understand what I'm going through, and then they name the emotion, and then they realize like, wow, there's a name for what I'm experiencing. The thing to know is that oftentimes parents and caregivers notice the negative emotions first and oftentimes work to label those, right? But what we actually want is not necessarily to ignore those negative emotions, right? When the child is angry, frustrated, or hurt, but we will also want the parent to start to notice and label positive emotions because those oftentimes go unnoticed, unlabeled. I think it's something like parents label 2 to 3 times more the negative emotions that they do positive emotions or something like that. So we want them to notice, other emotions like when their child feels happy, proud of themselves, when they're calm, when they're excited, those kinds of things. And then remembering that just because we're labeling emotions, it doesn't mean that a behavior is okay. So labeling an emotion is not necessarily giving too much attention to a behavior, right? Because all emotions are okay, and that's what we want toddlers and preschoolers to know, is that it's okay to be sad, angry, disappointed, right? Mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, we all experience those emotions. But what's not okay is the behavior that results, right? So that's kind of an important thing to know. So an example might be, the parent labeling the child's emotion. It looks like you feel happy that your dad is home because I see a smile on your face. The third tool is that we can label feelings in other people. So we can read and talk about emotions in picture books. We can also watch other children with the child and then label emotions that we see. Right. So an example might be, your friend Sam is crying. How do you think he's feeling? Why is it that he might feel this way? Okay. Now, step 2 in helping with emotional development is helping the child learn to soothe when they're having an emotion. And then the important thing is that when there's a strong emotion, right, because the emotion that a child has or might need help regulating with is when they're feeling oftentimes negative emotions. Rarely do you need regulating help when you're happy or joyful about something or excited about something. It's oftentimes when there's a negative emotion. So we want to be able to respond by helping them soothe themselves, or if they need help from a parent, providing kind of that co-regulation. But we also want to remember that there are certain behaviors that we don't want to give attention to, right? And those are the inappropriate behaviors. So, you want to note that if your child does hit or become aggressive, then you want to stay tuned for other parenting strategies on limit setting that are kind of later on in the manual. And then you can also, if the child's getting aggressive, consider you pulling in other strategies from the FAST-B manual. So first, in soothing emotions, you want to help your child self-soothe, and you can help them through self-soothe through physical touch and affection. So sometimes that might be a hug, right? So if your child's feeling kind of sad or disappointed about something, you might give them a hug, rub their back, you could hold their hand, you might stay physically close and kind of get down to their level. And again, using those other tools of labeling their emotions. You might help them take deep breaths. And it's also okay to know if your child does not want physical touch or does not respond well to physical touch, then of course you don't have to necessarily do that. The other thing is that you can also help them soothe by showing comfort with your words to help them feel understood. So this kind of goes in line with labeling emotions. So you might say something like, I'm here with you, I'm here to listen. Or you might say something like, you're sad that we cannot go to the park because it's raining. I know it's so disappointing. Or you can do this, you can try again, right? So these are different examples. You can also teach your child to soothe and distract themselves on their own. So, some examples here for parents could be like setting up a calm down spot at home, teaching the child to use a comfort item, showing the child just a more helpful way to express their feelings, right? Like taking deep breaths or using words to say how they're feeling. And then remembering that you do want to give less attention to unsafe or aggressive behavior. So if the toddler or preschooler is being unsafe, we try not to comment or give more attention to that behavior, because sometimes that can result in a child doing it more. So sometimes you want to gently set physical limits, so move items out of reach or get between them and the target. You might want to set kind of verbal limits, right? Like, if I understand that you're mad or you're really angry and frustrated, and it's not okay for you to hit, right? And then kind of setting a limit and boundary there. And so points of reflection for the parent below. And then the last one here, again, part of this kind of a boosting emotional development series, is that we can help kids learn to cope by watching. They watch us. They watch parents, caregivers. So one of the important concepts here is that we want to model for kids how to handle emotions when they're feeling, when we're feeling happy, sad, angry, or scared. And we want to talk about the emotions out loud and use, of course, child-friendly words. So we might list, we might encourage the parent to list some of their coping tools here. And then there's an activity here where the parent can do an activity with their child that might help them learn to calm down. So it's an activity where you have the parent fill up a clear bottle with some kind of a floating object. And then you kind of swirl it around, and you can teach the child that, our brain, when we're really frustrated or angry, is like this water bottle where all the floating object is kind of moving around. It's all wound up. And then, we have to kind of practice taking deep breaths, because that helps all the little floating objects kind of settle, right? And so teaching the child calming down strategies. And then also, if you're encouraging them to use it, we want them to see us use it, right? Because they're more likely to do it if they see adults and caregivers around them using it. Okay, then we have a checkpoint that's specifically focused on tantrums. So tantrums at this age are, very frustrating for parents. They're very disruptive. They can be embarrassing depending on where they happen, very annoying, and also 100% normal and expected. hardly ever do we see a toddler who does not have a tantrum, right? Completely normal. So here we outline just tools that parents can use to address tantrums. And here we provide just a brief rationale to parents of why we see tantrums during this age and why they probably occur with the frequency that they do. And as I mentioned in the overview earlier, it has to do a lot with just brain development happening at this age range, and the fact that parts of the brain that help with emotion regulation, impulse control, inhibition, those kinds of things are not fully developed at this age. So kids are gonna, have a tantrum, probably be a little too honest when they're really upset and angry. And it's kind of reminding the parent that they don't have the filters at this age. They don't have kind of the bumpers to help them keep them in line, to know what's okay, what's not okay. And that's where the parents come in, right? They can be the child's bumpers, setting the limits. So even though there are tantrums, we want to respond again effectively, help them cope, and then also set boundaries and limits there. So the way we've broken down this checkpoint is by talking about what to do when the parent starts to see a tantrum come on board. Usually parents can see the warning signs, right? And there's a couple of tools and techniques that parents can use to avoid a full-blown tantrum. So there's kind of paying attention to what it looks like as it's creeping up. What do you do when there is a full-blown tantrum? And then also, what do you do after a tantrum has happened? Because at each of those time points, it is important, again, kind of going back to this idea of early relational health, right? The importance of early childhood mental health is that the core kind of component to social emotional development and well-being in this age range is kind of that parent-child connection, that nurturing relationship, that caregiving relationship. And so at each of these time points, we want the parent to be effective while also maintaining kind of that secure, nurturing relationship with the child. So recovering from the tantrum is just as important as how the parent deals with the tantrum. So here we have kind of the common warning signs. Parent can kind of mark these, the warning signs that they might see when there's a rising tantrum, and then also the most common places to help them kind of plan ahead, right? Like, when am I likely to see a tantrum for my little one? And then how can I prepare for each of those situations? So a few of the strategies that a parent or caregiver can use to avoid a full-blown tantrum that work really well with toddlers. I wouldn't say that this works well with like school-age kids necessarily, but that's kind of the cool and neat thing about young kiddos, is that they can respond really well to not always going to the disciplinary strategies, right? So sometimes all that will help is just changing the situation, right? So if we're seeing a rising tantrum, maybe we can, get outside, change up the scenery for the child so that they might forget the reason for the tantrum. This is one of the helpful things we can take advantage of, right? Children have kind of short attention spans, so we can probably use that to our advantage and just change the context, change the situation, and see if that helps them kind of regulate. The other is that we can use humor. So maybe if you're noticing your child's kind of starting to get a little moody, it's going to get a little negative. Okay, so now we can do something like, be a little goofy or unexpected if we're trying to tell them to do something. We might play kind of a silly game where we give them kisses on the belly or on the cheek and make them laugh. We might make a funny face, and that might get them to laugh, smile, right? Get them in a little mood, kind of come back from that moment of kind of moodiness, and then we can kind of do the next thing that we were wanting to do with them, right? So it kind of serves as a little bit of a reaction from to kind of snap them out of that, essentially that rising tantrum. The other is to distract and redirect. So sometimes that means that we might be pointing towards a new or different activity. We might come prepared with games, toys, or snacks. Sometimes, and this is one I really like, is that we can whisper really softly so that the child kind of tries to focus their attention on what we're saying. Or we can offer a sensory activity like water or ice cubes or something like that that might serve as another way to distract them or cope with that emotion. And then the other is that we can also just give the child words for what they're experiencing, right? So kind of goes back to that labeling the child's emotions. So we can say, you know, I can see that you're mad because we can't stay here. We can't stay at the park like you wanted to, right? And then you want to give options for what they can do instead. So you're labeling, but then you're giving options. So let's ask for help with this toy. You know, help me, mama, help me, papa. So giving the child words for why they might be frustrated or angry in a situation can really go a long way. Again, helping them feel understood. So these are just some situations to avoid a full-blown tantrum. Now, because I mentioned that tantrums are unavoidable, sometimes no matter what we do, a toddler or preschooler is going to have a meltdown. And when we cannot stop the storm, what we do is we focus on physical and emotional safety and we wait out the storm. We let it run its course before we intervene again. So what this means is that we want parents to understand that, there's a couple of things that we want them to do. We want them to talk less to their child, right? And really turn our attention away for brief moments to avoid giving attention to the tantrum, right? So that's one. Once it's happened, we kind of want to remove our attention, kind of let it run its course. So you can think about this as like planned ignoring, right, from the FAST-B manual. And then you want to focus on making the physical environment safe. So you might be removing things your child could throw or things that could spill or break in their immediate vicinity, right? That's part of the physical safety. And then the other thing is you want to stay close so you are ready to reconnect with your child once they are calm. The other is that you also want to hold firmly the boundary, right? So if your child had a tantrum because they couldn't have a cookie or something like that, then if the child's had a tantrum, okay, again, you're turning away your attention, letting them kind of have that the tantrum run its course. You are removing things in the environment that might make it likely for them to kind of get aggressive. And then you are still holding firm to that boundary. So you're not giving in to the original reason that the tantrum may have happened. So here we encourage the parent or caregiver to reflect on how to provide support for their child, both physically, but also emotionally. Emotional safety includes a couple of things. One is that we want the parent or caregiver to stay visibly close to the child, visible distance. And then, of course, to kind of monitor safety, that kind of thing. And then we want the parent to remain calm and then reassuring, right? So, because when the child is having an emotional kind of meltdown, the big emotions they're having, whether it's frustration, disappointment, anger, can be kind of scary for them as well, right? Especially if it's a toddler who's kind of learning about emotions. And so we don't want the parent to kind of match that level, right? So we want the parent to stay calm. We want them to be reassuring, right? That once they're calm, then the parent is there and ready to help, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean you're giving attention to the behavior. You're just letting them know in a calm way, like I'm ready to talk, or I'm ready to help you once you're calm. Okay. Then what happens after a tantrum, right? Recovering from a tantrum is just as important because we want to reestablish kind of the sense of safety, of security by letting the child know, that we still love them. And then we also, again, like I mentioned, we still are going to hold firm to the original expectation for the behavior. So here are some do's and don'ts. So do's after a tantrum, again, we want us to kind of stay close. We might want to model for the child how to calm down, especially if they've stopped screaming and crying. Sometimes kids, you can notice that they get really just emotionally invested in the tantrum, so they might have a hard time breathing. So you might model for them how to breathe, how to calm down. You might reconnect with them once they're calm, right? You might give them a hug. You could say, I love you. You did a nice job calming down, or thank you for, having an inside voice, that kind of thing. And then you might want to help them find something to do that is safe and acceptable after the tantrum. Because that way they can kind of distract themselves away from the original situation. I think also during the tantrum, it's helpful for the parent to have something to distract themselves, so that, we're not inadvertently giving attention to the tantrum. The don'ts after a tantrum is that we don't need to be angry. We don't need to, there's no need for more anger in that situation. We don't necessarily want to offer any punishments. There's no need for lecture, and no shaming or criticizing the child after the tantrum has happened. Again, children are learning about their emotions during this time, right? So we don't necessarily want to add any shame to it. We want to help them, again, learn to cope better. And we want them to learn about what the expectations are. So when we hold those limits after a tantrum, or when a tantrum has happened, that's a way of doing that. So here, this is kind of the part here of holding firm limits. So children often have tantrums after being told no, or when adults set a limit. So it's important to hold firm the limit that the parent has set, even after a tantrum has started, to help the child learn, the rules and expectations that the parent is trying to set. Okay, so here is a worksheet where the parents can essentially plan for tantrums, right? So because we know that these are going to happen, they're unavoidable. What are some things that we can do when there is a rising tantrum, right? What would be something that I might have in my back pocket, so that when I see the trigger signs, the warning signs, I could try these tools. And then what are some things that I can do when I'm riding out the storm, right? If the tantrum has already happened, how do I focus on physical safety and emotional safety? What are those things that I'm going to practice? And then after the tantrum, what might be a way that I reconnect with my child? Well, again, holding firm to the limit. And it's hard to stay calm when managing a tantrum. So below here, we have some examples for how to manage the parents' own feelings during a tantrum, so that we, again, a big part of emotional safety is the parent caregiver remains calm and reassuring, right? So we want parents to also have tools that they can use to regulate themselves, keep themselves calm during those moments. So a couple of things to think about and things that the parent can do. And then there are, of course, tips and tricks here. So things that might be questions that might come up. So my child gets more upset when I try to calm them down. What might be some talking points with the parent? My child is violent toward me when I try to calm them down. What are some kind of talking points there? And then I get angry at my child, which of course is a common feeling that parents might have. So how to help them in those moments. Checkpoint 5, it's all about helping toddlers be more independent through choices. And so that's what this kind of checkpoint is about. It's how to give toddlers and preschooler choices to help them follow directions. So here we want parents to kind of learn how to give options to their child, right? We want to start maybe with 2 choices. We want to try making one option more fun so that the child is more likely to comply. And then we want to practice having them make decisions with kind of low stress situations. And then after a child, if a parent is offering the child choices, we always want the parent to kind of acknowledge, wow, you made a choice, right? So, so they know that was kind of, they got a say in that decision. Okay, so first we start off with offering choices during routines and transitions. These can be a difficult for little ones is to kind of transition from activities. So offering choices during this time can be really helpful. Routines are important because they really give young children kind of predictability. They tell them what's happening next in their day. And then when children know their routine, they become more independent over time because they know what comes next, right? A lot of times with routines, children kind of get, well, when there aren't routines, sometimes children kind of get, maybe they have their hopes up that they're going to get to do something right after preschool, or the next part in the day, and maybe they want to go to the park and they really want that to do that. When it doesn't happen, oftentimes that can result in some behavioral challenges or some disappointment. So routines also reduce behavior problems because because young children know what to expect and they're not essentially getting their hopes up, right? They know exactly what comes next. If for some reason there is a change in the routine and it's kind of a positive thing, right? Like maybe there is a trip to the park that day, then that can be exciting, but it's not necessarily expected because they know what the routine is and they know how to follow it. So the key things for parents and caregivers here is to just keep the routine simple. And you can involve kids in planning the routine. So letting them make choices throughout the routine can make it fun for kids and easier for parents. And you can use pictures and visuals for that as well. Here we have a breakdown for when a child needs to transition. So if you have a toddler preschooler that needs to move on to something else, and those situations are likely to trigger some behavioral outbursts, we have a couple of ideas that parents can try. So one is when there are a few minutes left in a situation where the child needs to transition, it can be helpful to give a warning that there's time for one more of whatever it is the child is doing. So maybe it's you have time for one more game, what are you going to choose? So that's giving them kind of a heads up. The other situation or scenario could be when it's time to go right now, right? Like there's no more time. Maybe the parent gave a warning and now it's time to go. So here it can be really helpful if the parent kind of gives an choices for how the child can transition to the activity or where, right? So an example might be we have to go to the car. Should we run or should we hop there? Right? That sounds fun. So there you're not necessarily giving the choice to a child of whether or not they go to the car. It's how they're going to the car. And then when there is no choice, then you can always let your child or the child decide the order. So maybe an example might be, it's almost bedtime. Do you want to put on your pajamas or brush your teeth first? Right? So there again, there's really no choice. This has to happen, but they get a say into how it's going to happen or what they do first. So here we have an example routine with a set of planned choices the parent can have at each of those transitions. And we have a series of images that parents can use to create their own routine for their child. So you can see here on the next page that the parent can choose the different steps. They can take a picture or cut out a picture from that previous page and paste it here. And then think through what might be a choice, right? A planned choice that I can offer my toddler or preschooler during this activity, or if I'm transitioning, to help that routine go better. And then at the bottom, helping them think through, what might be a cue or a signal that I give my toddler or preschooler that it's time to start a new routine. So maybe give a warning, use a bell, a timer, or give them a choice for how they can start the next routine, or start the routine, I should say. Okay, and then checkpoint 6 here is boosting the child's ability to follow directions. So here we focus a lot more on just helping kids learn what the expectations are and then following those directions that are set by the parent or caregiver. When we set appropriate limits and boundaries, this really helps children learn that their environment is safe, right? It's predictable. Part of kids' job is to really push limits, right? And a lot of times they're going to push those limits. So I think it's important to give young children guidance and opportunities to practice the expectations, right, that the parent is giving them. And so here we provide just different steps for how to do this, how to set limits and how to help them follow directions. So the first is that we want the parents and caregivers to set the limit clearly and simply. So we want them to tell the child what they want them to do. We want to avoid saying you can't or don't, right? And examples might be, it is not safe to be on the table. You need your feet on the floor. So there I'm saying exactly what I want the child to do, and it's stated positively, meaning I'm telling them what to do as opposed to what not to do. Okay, and then if the child is doing that, then I'm, catching them and I'm saying, wow, you're doing it. You have your feet where they should be. You are being safe. The second is that you can offer a choice. Again, toddlers at this age are really striving for independence. They feel like they can do more than they can. So when we can offer choices, that can be really helpful in getting them to comply. And we want to give them 10 seconds to make the right choice on their own. And then you just want to make sure that you keep the same expectation every time to help them learn the limit in the future. So again, keeping the same example of keeping their feet on the floor, you could say something like, you put your feet on the floor. You can put your feet on the floor, or I can help you down. What is your choice? Right? So there, again, the expectation is the feet have to be on the floor, but they could either do that themselves, or as a parent, you can help them. And then the third is you want to acknowledge that the child made a choice, even if they chose to break the limit, right? And remembering that we can allow feelings, but we want to limit the behavior. So all feelings are okay, but not all behaviors are okay. So an example here might be something like, it looks like you want to stay on the table, but that is not safe. I'm going to help you down. Next time, you can choose to do it yourself, right? So there, I'm acknowledging that they had made a choice, and then I'm helping them down, and then I'm reminding them, there's a better choice next time if they were unhappy with the help. So here we want parents to kind of practice, right? So what are some 2 to 3 problem behaviors that maybe keep happening? And then we want them to think about what they would want the child to do instead of the problem behavior. So the positive opposite, right? That's going to help with knowing what limit to set or what expectation to give. And then now that they have that information, we want to practice the following, right? Setting the limit clearly and simply and saying what we want them to do. Remembering the positive opposite, right? So what we want them to do versus what we don't want them to do. And then offering a choice. So giving them 10 seconds. And then if they don't do that, what may be the choices that I give them? And then acknowledging that they made a choice, but then even if they broke the limit. So how is the parent or caregiver going to follow through? Okay, so we made it through the core parts of the manual, and then the next part here is going to be the bonus checkpoints that are really on various different topics that are most common in early childhood that you might get questions about from parents, and so you can reference some of the handouts here. The first one is on child's development and whether it's delayed. So a lot of times parents have questions about that and worry about their child's development. And so if a parent is concerned, we often encourage them to visit the Center for Disease Control guidelines, because they have really the developmental milestones for, from birth to across the lifespan for kids, and the different milestones that we would expect them to meet at this age. The guidelines that they have set are described according to what 75% of children meet on average in terms of milestones. So it means that usually about 25% of children still need a little more time. But if you have a parent that's concerned, this might be a handout that you can share with them. We summarize here the developmental milestones for the first 3 years of life or so, but you can also have the parent reference kind of the CDC for more information. And then we have some information here about how to obtain early intervention services if the child is 0 to 3, or child find if the child is between the ages of 3 and 5. And then, of course, if there are some behavioral issues that are coming up that are not necessarily those that can be addressed with FAST-E, then recommending parent behavior management training, which can be very helpful for again, behavioral challenges, behavioral concerns. You can also think about drawing in material from FAST-B. Here we have a checkpoint handout for boosting success in early childhood education. So as children start preschool, this is kind of their first touch point with the educational system. They might be at a home-based care center or preschool or Head Start or whatever the setting can be. It can be really helpful for parents to have tools for how to connect and work with their teachers. So we have listed here a couple of benefits to having the child participate in an early childhood education center. And then we have some tools and things for parents to consider to, again, build that kind of positive relationship with the preschooler's teacher. And here is just kind of a little bit of an overview for parents and something to kind of walk them through. What information do they feel like would be helpful to share with the teacher? Because I think when preschoolers and toddlers start, to participate in a daycare setting or preschool setting, they spend a lot of time with the kiddo, right? But they rarely know exactly what's going on around the child or what's kind of going on in the child's kind of immediate family. Sometimes those things can be important in understanding the child a little bit more. And so as much as the parent is comfortable or the caregiver is comfortable, you can have them think through what parts of their child, their family, and their community do they feel like is important and might be important to share with the teacher, the child's school teacher. The other things that are important is also for parents to kind of reflect on their own experiences, kind of growing up, going to school, what was hard for them, what were relationships with their teachers like, and then what did they value about school. Sometimes our own kind of experiences with the school system can either bias us when we're trying to work with teachers or working with schools. And so I think it's important to kind of understand that a little bit more and see kind of the parents' perspective, where they're coming from and how we might be able to help if they're really trying to connect but having a hard time with the school. Here are a series of tips and tricks that might be helpful in interacting with the child's teacher. So we kind of broken down into things that the parent can do, things that they might want to avoid, and kind of a rationale for each of these. With checkpoint 9, we talk about sleep, a very common concern in the toddler and preschool years. So we start off by kind of giving a little bit of an overview of what the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends. We encourage, the parent to have kind of a regular bedtime and a time when the routine is going to start. Sometimes some kids need a little more time than we might expect to kind of get into their routine and then finally get to bed. And so we offer the parent essentially some space here to think through what the steps for their bedtime routine would be, and then what the rituals that they would want to have around bedtime. So what are some things we might incorporate as part of the bedtime routine? And then we have some strategies for parents who have kids who won't stay in bed. So that might include setting a timer for 2 to 5 minutes at first and letting the child know that you're going to come in and check on them. And this way, your attention can reward them for staying in bed rather than leaving the bed to find you and then giving them attention that way. And then, of course, you can increase the time that you are going to take before coming into bed to kind of help them stay in bed longer without having you come in. And then also some options for if the child gets upset gets up too early, some suggestions for parents and caregivers there. Then we have nap time and routine. So some suggestions, there's like typical nap time schedules for kids between these ages, and what parents can accept or expect, I'm sorry. So this handout just outlines how to help parents help their child separate, especially if they're having some anxiety around that. And so we start off by just describing some of the most common challenges with separation in this kind of 1 to 4 year age range. And then we have the parent kind of reflect on what are some of the behaviors that they see in their child, and then what's likely to trigger those behaviors. So kind of checking the box and then allowing some space if does not apply. If these options above don't apply, then outlining each of those here below. And then there are some kind of ways that we encourage parents to help these separations go better. So sometimes it involves preparing the child ahead of time. So before that transition is going to happen, how do we talk to the child about what to expect? Of course, labeling the child's emotions about that change or transition. And then we also want to consider other things that might help them cope during that transition. Maybe that means we use a comfort item or something like that. Then when the separation actually takes place, is that we can help make that goodbye predictable. So, always saying goodbye. And then once the caregiver or parent leaving, not coming back for repeated trips, right? Or trying to comfort the child, because that actually makes the separation a lot harder. Maybe it means establishing a brief goodbye routine, whether that's with a secret handshake, a kiss, or a reassuring thumbs up. Maybe that means we acknowledge how the child is feeling, right? So kind of making that predictable. And then I think, for any parent, anxiety around separation can be really hard, especially if we're leaving and we're seeing the child in distress. And so anxiety or that distress can be contagious. So it's important for caregivers to feel calm, because if the child senses that the parent or caregiver is worried or unsure about the separation or transition, then they are going to match that. They're going to feel the same way too. So encouraging the parent to have distractions that work well for them, or planning something after the separation or drop off to help them get through it. For older preschoolers, parents can actually invite them to think about what will help. So asking questions like, what do you think we can do to help those worries go away? Is there something fun you can plan to do when I'm leaving that will help you feel better? Or is there something special that helps you feel extra brave? Let's practice, right? So having them kind of participate. Preschoolers usually have a lot more language. And if parents have been practicing kind of the emotional development strategies, they might have more emotions, words, and can speak to how they feel in certain situations. Meal times are also a challenging time for toddlers and preschoolers. Oftentimes they might become picky eaters, right? So having a hard time with that. So here we have some just tips for creating consistency and stopping and hopefully improving, maybe not stopping altogether, but improving some of the struggles at mealtime. And then below we have just the what ifs, right? So if the child is not hungry at mealtime, what can the parent do? If the child complains about what is served, what can the parent do? If the child is showing poor table manners, eats with their hands or squishes food, right? Well, how can the parent respond? If the child is throwing the food, or if there's some weight concerns, what the parent can do. And then toilet training or boosting potty training, that can be a really challenging topic for a lot of parents as well. So this kind of table just walks parents through what to look for in order to be ready to toilet train, how to introduce the potty or the toilet, and then strategies for making that go well. So, sometimes parents have no more diaper days, right? And so how to kind of prepare for that. If the parent wants to use a treat or a reward for sitting on the potty, that can be a helpful strategy. How to transition to underwear, and then just keeping that kind of process positive, because of course parents can get easily frustrated, rightfully so, when they're trying so hard and there's mess after mess after mess, for example, and lots of laundry to keep doing. So I think some strategies and tips for parents there. And then when there's issues of constipation, for example, what the parent can do. So lots of just tips for the parent to consider. And then the last handout we have here that I think is also a pretty important one is just helping the parent boost their coping, right? So as I mentioned before, parenting is a very demanding job, right? It's one of the few jobs we have where you have to be on duty 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? So parents' mental health, parent self-care is a priority, and it's important in order for kids to thrive, right? So parents need to learn to take care of their own needs, learn what helps them recharge, especially when they're feeling overwhelmed, because that's harder. They're going to be better equipped to handle situations with their toddlers or preschoolers. So we offer just some information here. And then, of course, if you have a parent that you're working with where they're having feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, worthlessness, right? There's difficulties with energy, loss of interest. It's important to be asking about some of these other concerns, right? Like suicide, self-harm, or thoughts of hurting their child. I think these are kind of scary topics to talk about, but if you're working with a parent who has even a 1-year-old, for example, and it's a parent who has had challenges with postpartum depression or a history of depression or something like that, parenting having those challenges go on can make parenting a lot harder. And so it's important to make sure that we ask the questions and helping the family kind of seek additional help and support to addressing those challenges. It's kind of going back to that tip of the iceberg, right? So what else is underneath it, right? That might be contributing to that and helping get those appropriate supports in place. So with that, we'll transition back to the PowerPoint here. So thank you so much for participating in this FAST-E training. We look forward to seeing you all at the live training. And as you kind of watch this presentation and you got a chance to look at the manual, we do want you to write down your top 3 questions that you have and email them to us to fast@seattlechildrens.org with the subject FAST-E questions, so that we can make sure that we address them the day of the live training. These could be questions about things that you feel like maybe are missed. Maybe you have a question about, well, what about if we see this happen, we didn't see it addressed in the FAST-E manual, or maybe there's a question about, how do we handle parent resistance, or, how do I introduce this topic? I could see a parent saying this, right? So all of those questions are welcome. And then we, of course, want you to come prepared to interact and practice, because we're hoping that we can make it kind of a interactive and lively training for all of you. And thank you so much. We'll see you at the live training.